Chapter 20. The Signalman's Tale. By the time the sounds of battle gave way to silence, we had entered a different world. Though harsh and forbidding in their own right, the hills and cliffs of the reef were a lush oasis next to the desolation which now surrounded us. The ground, hard and smooth as a billiard table, stretched out unbroken in every direction, dusted with a thin layer of sand and scattered stones. A sickly brown haze hung on the horizon, and when the wind blew, it whipped up small white whirlwinds of dust that skittered past. It was a vast frying pan, with not a single tree, shrub, or hill to give respite from the merciless sun. And in the distance, giant lakes of quicksilver seemed to shimmer, only to evaporate as we drew closer. Not an hour after setting off, Ivan began to totter in the saddle, swaying in ever wider arcs before slumping to the side and sliding with a dull thud to the ground. I leapt down from my camel and rushed to his side as Pierre, having regained consciousness, frantically disentangled himself from Ivan's body. Ivan groaned and rolled onto his back, clawing back his robe to reveal a great crimson stain spreading across his shirt. "Bliat!" he grunted. "Get a dressing." I turned to search for the rucksack when Pierre appeared at my side, frantically unwrapping packets of gauze and laying them on the wound. "Are you all right, Sergeant?" he said. "Better than Gustav's cooking," said Ivan, laughing grimly. "Edward, keep the pressure on it. Try to stop the bleeding." I laid my hands on the wad of gauze and hesitantly pressed down, but recoiled as Ivan cried out. "No," he grunted. Go back. Keep going." Ivan's face contorted into a mask of agony as I pressed back down on the wound. "There's morphine here, Sergeant," said Pierre. No, said Ivan, waving him off. "Keep it for yourself, Corporal. You'll need it." With a pained expression, Pierre nodded. "How are you feeling, Corporal?" said Ivan. "Not bad," said Pierre. "A little hazy, but I'll be all right." Beneath my fingers the gauze was already soaked through with blood, and no matter how many rolls we piled atop the wound, we could not staunch the bleeding. Then Ivan's body began to shake, his chest heaving in great spasms. But after a moment of panic, I realized he was laughing. "What's so funny?" "Ha," said Ivan, glancing at his wounds. "Look like the bastards finally got me after all." "What bastards?" "The Bolsheviks," said Ivan. "The ones your medic held in such high regard." "He wasn't any medic," said Pierre, holding up Sean's identity discs. Silently he handed them to Ivan, who turned them over between his fingers. "Should have known," he said, tossing the discs to the ground. Picking them up, I saw they read merely, S. Lamb, Private, 08031917. "I knew something wasn't quite right about him," said Pierre. "No medic worth his salt would dress a wound as sloppily as that. Even I can do better, and I—" He fell silent and held up his trembling hands. "I don't understand," I said. "Why would he lie about being a medic?" "Keep pressing," Ivan snapped, and I dropped the discs and returned to my task. "To make himself seem useful," said Ivan. "Otherwise the Riffians would have just killed him, or worked him to death. Lazy, opportunistic bastards, all of them." "But Sean told me the Bolsheviks freed the Russian people," I said. "Ha!" Ivan spat. "Some freedom. You know what they did when they came to power? They rounded everyone up, every minor functionary, every factory owner and middle manager, every priest, school teacher, doctor, shopkeeper, every soldier who hadn't joined them, anyone who owned more than a few acres of land or a couple of cows, anyone with a sliver of wealth or power or half a brain, anyone who could raise an ounce of resistance. Millions of people, rounded them all up like cattle. What did they do to them? Shot them mostly. Some they sent to Siberia, to labor camps, worked them to death." "Did they capture you?" "They tried," said Ivan. "I was with the Royal Guard, sworn to protect the king." "The Tsar," I said, recalling a distant memory. "Yes, the Tsar," said Ivan. "Whole company of Bolshevik soldiers marched up to the Winter Palace, told us to join them or be shot. Of course none of us did. A lot of men died for their Tsar that day. But the royal family wasn't in the palace. They'd all escaped, we thought. So when most of my comrades were dead and I knew it was over, I got out of there, made my way home, to get my family out of Russia." Tears streamed down Ivan's face, which had grown pale as the dust beneath him. "But they'd already got them," he croaked. "Katya, my wife, my daughters, Irina, Svetlana, lined them up against the kitchen wall, shot them like dogs." Silence hung as the Russian giant wept, broken only by the wind whistling through the sand. "I had nothing left," he continued. "Not even the royal family. The Bolsheviks herded them into a basement and shot them. So I marched south, all the way to Poland, then to France, and the Legion. Wincing, Ivan raised his head and looked me right in the eye. You remember that, Edward. People will say anything, promise you anything. Never believe them. The only ones you can trust are your comrades, your squad mates. Even Thierry knew that. Why did he join them, I said. The Riffians, I mean. And why did they attack each other? I thought El-Krim wanted to join forces with Rasuli. Who knows, said Ivan. It's like our own leaders. There can only be one in charge, one leader of free Morocco. Neither El-Krim or Rasuli would share power. As for Thierry, well, the Legion was supposed to strip away our nationalities, our allegiances, form us into a brotherhood. Legio Patria Nostra. The Legion is our nation. But I don't think he ever found that brotherhood, ever felt like he was one of us. He was always looking towards home, towards his people, looking to avenge them. I dropped my eyes to the ground, feeling a right fool. I thought, I said in a small voice, I thought he was going to kill me, that you both were. What? Said Ivan. Why on earth would we want to kill you? I shrugged, because I wasn't useful, because I was in the way, like Jacques said. Ha! Said Ivan. What a world it would be if we all listened to Jacques. The man was a pig. No, Edward, you're our shipmate, and we always stand by our shipmates. That was our oath, right, Pierre? Pierre nodded. Remember that, Edward, said Ivan. Always stand by your comrades, always. As I nodded, Pierre placed a fresh wad of gauze atop the pile. Look, said Pierre excitedly as the dressing remained white. The bleeding is stopping. Good. Bind it in place, said Ivan. You've got to get going. It'll be dusk soon. Pierre and I glanced at each other in confusion. But, Sergeant, it's still morning, said Pierre. Noon at most. Then why is it getting so cold, said Ivan. Then a look of stunned realization came over him, the same look of wide-eyed horror I'd seen on Jacques' face the moment the life was drained from him. Looking down, I saw a pool of blood beneath Ivan's body, spreading mere inches before it was soaked up by the thirsty earth. Ivan's body grew limp, his arms falling to his sides, his eyes rolling back to face the empty sky. Then his chest fell like a great bellows, his last breath carrying a final testament as it whistled through his lips. I always hated this place. So died Sergeant Ivan Kaminsky, like so many legionnaires before him, in a barren desert 1,000 miles from home. Numbly, I rose and staggered back towards my camel, past Colin, who had watched the whole scene with wide-eyed horror. But Pierre laid his hand on my shoulder and held me back. Not like this, he said. Not like this. There's no way for a soldier to rest. Pierre bent down, lifted a small stone, and placed it atop Ivan's body. Silently, Colin and I joined in, entombing Ivan under a rough cairn. Into this Pierre plunged his rifle, hanging Ivan's identity disc from the bolt as if to proclaim to the wasteland, a soldier lies here. Neither of us knew any prayers, so we stood in silence before the grave for a long while. 1,000 thoughts flew through my head like an artillery barrage, each landing with an agonizing crash. I felt the solid ground give way beneath my feet, as it had when Father spirited me away that cold December night, and again when he abandoned me at the Dundee police station. I was lost, adrift, unsure of what to believe, what to do or say, or why. Every time I thought I had this world figured out, a new veil was lifted. At last I turned to Pierre and broke the silence. I want to go home, I said. Once more we set up the radio and set a bearing to the aerodrome, 13 degrees northeast. Then, with Pierre in the lead, we set off, leaving Ivan's grave to stand its lonely vigil over the bled. We rode on through the day and the night, stopping only to rest the camels. With only one water bag between us, we raced to reach the aerodrome before it ran out. In the merciless heat of day, it was hard to think of anything but that next meager ration, but I kept my eyes on the horizon, hoping to catch the first glimpse of a hangar, a control tower, or radio aerial in the distance. Yet for 3 days and 3 nights, the landscape around us remained unchanged. Indeed, we could hardly tell we had traveled any distance at all, for the camels left no tracks on the hard desert floor. But most unnerving of all was the silence. I'd expected to see aircraft overhead or hear the roar of aero engines in the distance, but the skies were empty, the only sound the wind and the steady crunch of the camels' hooves. Edward, said Colin. Yes? Where are we going? To an aerodrome. An aerodrome, said Colin excitedly. You mean we get to fly? Yes. I've never been in an aeroplane before, have you? No, I haven't. Edward? Yes? I was wondering, how'd you know what my name was? Mr. Sutherland, your father told me. Really? Said Colin. You saw him? Yes, about a week ago. Wait, then how'd you get all the way out here? It's a long story. It's all right, said Colin. I love stories. But weary from the journey, I shook my head and turned my gaze back to the horizon. Well, Colin pestered me, come on then. Why don't you tell me how you got out here, I said. Your father said you ran away. Colin hesitated. You promise you won't tell him? Promise. Well, ever since I can remember, I've always wanted to join the Navy, sail the world like Drake and Nelson. But father always says I'm too young, that it's too dangerous. I told him I already know everything about ships and the Royal Navy and everything, but he still says no, not until I'm 16. But I know he's lying, that he won't ever let me join up, even if I was older. So I went down to the docks to try and find a ship to take me to England so I could sign up myself. Most of them said no, but then I met these French sailors. Scary-looking they were, like pirates from a book. Most of them didn't even speak English, but there was one who did, and he told me he could take me to England. I told him I hadn't any money, but he said that they'd take me for free. Imagine that. I wanted to write a note to father, tell them where I was going, but they said they were leaving right away, and if I didn't come now, they'd leave without me. Well, right off when we left Quetta, I knew something was off, since they started going east, even though I knew England was west. I told them, you're going the wrong way, but they said they had one more delivery to make before they could go back to England. They sailed to this little beach, you see, where there were a lot of Arabs waiting with horses and guns. The Frenchmen took a lot of boxes and crates off the ship and put them on the beach, but when it was time to go back to the ship, one of the Arabs grabbed me and the Frenchmen got on board and left without me. Colin, I said, what did this Frenchman look like, the one who spoke English? He was real big and scruffy looking, said Colin, with these sleepy red eyes. And what was his name? Colin thought for a moment. It was a funny name, Jock or something like that, which I remember thinking was strange since he was French and not Scottish. Father and I are Scottish, of course, so we knew about those kinds of names. As Colin chattered on, I felt a knot tighten in the pit of my stomach. What a lot I'd fallen in with. A ship of murderers, traitors, gamblers, smugglers, and now, it seemed, kidnappers and slavers. Yet among them were noble men who would die without hesitation for their comrades. What a world. All right, your turn then, said Colin. How did you get out here? Well, Edward! Edward! Look! Pierre cried, frantically pointing to the horizon, where I spotted a flash of white and red in the distance. Pierre drew out his riding crop and spurred his camel into a gallop. Is that the aerodrome? Said Colin. Yes, I said, grinning ear to ear as I whipped my camel and chased after Pierre. All doubts and worries were immediately forgotten, for at long last I was going home. As we drew near, the object grew into a tall rectangular tower, brick red with white lettering down its side. Strangely, it rose alone on the empty plain, with no hangars or even parked aircraft surrounding it. Perhaps I thought these lay behind some hidden ridge that we would soon crest. But like a mirage vanishing before my eyes, the tower was suddenly revealed for what it was. A wing of a crashed airplane jutting up from the desert floor. Scraps of twisted wreckage lay strewn all about, while the tail, crumpled like a concertina, reared up into the air, its tattered canvas fluttering in the breeze like the feathers of an enormous bird. Hello, I called out. Is anyone there? But as I circled my camel around the wreck, I saw the bloodied crown of a leather flying helmet hanging out the open cockpit. Edward, said Colin, where's the aerodrome? I shook my head in disbelief. I don't... Pierre? I don't understand it, said Pierre, climbing down from his camel. It should be here. It should be. The signal was coming from this direction. Yes, it was coming from here. And the signal was too strong to be coming from... It was 13 degrees north. Suddenly he clapped his hand to his brow, staring off towards the south in slack-jawed horror. Oh God, he cried. Oh God, oh God, oh God. I leapt to the ground and rushed to his side. What is it, Pierre? What's wrong? Where's the aerodrome? Of course. How could I forget? Pierre mumbled to himself, striking his palm against his brow. Stupid. How could I be so stupid? Pierre, where's the aerodrome? Stupid. How could I ever... Pierre! I snapped, seizing his wrists. He fell silent, staring at me with wide, frightened eyes. Where is the aerodrome? I repeated. Slowly, Pierre extended his arm and pointed a trembling finger off towards the southwest. 1,000 kilometers, he said. That way. What? The directional aerial, the loop, he sobbed. It works both ways, both directions. I thought it was coming from the northeast, but it was southwest, Cap Gibe. It's coming from Cap Gibe. My jaw dropped. But how can that be, I said. You said the signal was too strong to be coming from there, that it had to be coming from nearby. How can... Piao sunk to his knees, buried his head in his hands, and began rocking back and forth. It happens sometimes, he croaked. If the atmosphere is right, if there's a path through the mountains, it can guide the waves, keep the signal strong. How could I forget? How could I... His words dissolved into an incomprehensible babble as I slipped into another fit, writhing and twitching in the dust. In that moment, as the reality of our situation dawned on me, my heart did not sink, did not plummet. It burst. The aerodrome, that beacon of hope which has shone at the end of this odyssey, spurring me on through every arduous step, was no more than a mirage, a madman's fantasy. I turned in place, the empty horizon swirling about me. To the south lay only certain death or slavery, and to the north, I did not know. The blood might have gone on for 10, 100, or 1,000 miles, and we had only enough water to last a day or two. "Edward," said Colin. "What's happened? What's wrong with him?" I stared blankly ahead, struggling to think through the crackling static swiftly flooding my mind. "Edward?" He's sick," I managed to choke out. "What's happened?" said Colin. "Where's the aerodrome?" "It's not," I started, but seeing the fear and apprehension in those wide, innocent eyes, I felt the words catch in my throat. I don't know why I couldn't bear to tell him the truth. Perhaps I could not bear to hear it myself. Or perhaps having witnessed the harsh realities of the seafaring life Colin so craved, I could not bring myself to shatter his illusions. For the first time in my life, I began to understand Father. "We haven't reached it yet," I said. "It's still a day or two away." "But I heard him say it doesn't exist," Colin countered. "That's not true, is it?" "No," I said. "He's mad. He doesn't know what he's talking about." "Then why are we here? Shouldn't we keep going?" "Quiet!" I snapped. "Let me think." As I struggled to think, I felt a cool breeze ruffle my hair. Glancing west, I saw the sun sinking low to the horizon. "It'll be dark soon," I said. "We should pitch camp. We can't move until Piao's better anyway." Colin slowly nodded. "Come on," I said. "Help me put the tent together." "But I'm tired," Colin protested. "It'll be faster if we both," I started, but Colin wandered away, fetched a bedroll from the camel, and curled up on the ground. I stormed over and made to scold him, but seeing his ship and the bottle clutched to his chest like a stuffed animal, I held back. "Colin," I said, "your father said you're brilliant at building things. He even showed me your ships." "He did?" said Colin, perking up. "Yeah," I said, "brilliant stuff, and, well, I'm a bit rubbish at building things. I don't think I can figure out the tent myself." "Really?" Colin scoffed. "Yeah," I said, shrugging bashfully. "All thumbs." The ruse worked. While Colin leapt to his feet and rushed over to the camel to unpack the tent, I returned to check on Piao. Still in the throes of his fit, he could not be moved, so Colin and I pitched the tent around him. By the time we finished, night had fallen, and while there was plenty of wood from the wreck scattered about, we could not gather it in the pitch darkness. So we wrapped ourselves in bedrolls and saddle covers and hunkered down for the long, cold night ahead. I awoke at first light to find Piao still twitching and writhing in the corner of the tent. I stepped outside and lay on the sand, letting the sun warm my frozen body before venturing out to explore the wrecked aeroplane. Approaching the crumpled nose, I saw a line of bullet holes and a thick streak of oil and soot along the engine cowling, and realized this must have been the airplane the Riffians had shot down above the ruined village. Rounding the nose, I was suddenly overcome by the sickly sweet smell of rotting meat, and I saw the thick black cloud of flies buzzing about the pilot's head. Feeling my stomach turning, I paused and took a deep breath before continuing my approach. I sprang backwards as something suddenly leapt out of the cockpit and landed at my feet. It was a small fox-like creature, golden brown with comically large ears. It stared at me for a moment, licked its gore-stained lips, then scurried off into the bled. I won't describe what the elements had wrought on the poor pilot's body. The thought of it makes me shudder to this day. It was all I could do not to vomit as I wrapped my arms around his shoulders and tried to pull him free. But he would not budge, and after a moment I realized he was still strapped to his seat. So as flies buzzed around my head and that awful stench seeped down my throat, I reached into the cockpit and unbuckled his harness. But the corpse was still too heavy to lift, and after much straining and grappling, I abandoned the effort and staggered back to escape the stench. Once I'd recovered, I found a sharp piece of wreckage and used it to cut away the fabric from the side of the cockpit. and through this opening I finally managed to drag out the pilot's body. Retching all the while, I rifled through the pockets of his leather flying coat, finding a wallet, a packet of cigarettes, a stick of chewing gum, a box of matches, a small paper notebook, and a small paper bag full of stones. Retreating once more from the stench, I peered into the cockpit and at last found what I was looking for, a leather chart case hanging by the pilot's seat. From this I pulled out a chart and laid it on the ground, weighing down the corners with stones. The chart showed the whole of Morocco, with a red pencil line tracing the pilot's course from Cap Giby on the Atlantic coast to Rabat in the northeast. Along this route, in illegible handwriting, were scrawled the names of various villages and towns, but the crude sketch of a fortress at the foot of the mountains was unmistakable. From there, the route turned northeast over a vast stretch of empty desert, and a glance at the scale on the bottom of the chart confirmed my worst fear. Nearly 400 kilometers of barren wasteland lay ahead of us, not a single well or oasis along the way. Surviving such a journey would require every last drop of water we could find. Rummaging through the cockpit, I found a photograph of a woman taped to the instrument panel, an oil pan and a toolkit tucked under the pilot's seat, and a canteen down by the rudder pedals, which to my dismay turned out to be nearly empty. But as I braced my hand on a metal pipe to haul myself from the cockpit, it broke under my weight and began gushing a clear liquid. I gathered some in my hand, raised it to my nose, then carefully touched it to my tongue. Though it tasted of metal and petrol, it was water nonetheless, and with the canteen I gathered as much of it as I could. Using the spanner from the toolkit, I broke open the other hoses and pipes snaking behind the instrument panel, but these yielded only petrol and oil, which I gathered up in the oil pan. I searched the wreck stem to stern, finding little else but a compartment stuffed with envelopes, some cans of tinned food, and the map case hanging by the seat. This I took almost as an afterthought, reasoning that anything could be useful on our journey. But as I pulled the case away, I suddenly froze, for hidden behind it, mounted on a small metal plate, was a Morse key. It can't be, I thought, following the wire from the key as it snaked aft and disappeared behind the seat. I clambered out of the airplane and found a small metal hatch behind the cockpit, which opened to reveal a large black box. A radio. Overcome with excitement, I sprinted back to the tent. "Pierre!" I exclaimed, kneeling at his side. "You never believe it, I found a radio!" Still shaking and twitching uncontrollably, Pierre did not respond. "Pierre!" I shouted in his ear. No, he muttered. We're lost. It's not there. No, we're not, I assured him. I found a radio, come and see. No, it won't work. Yes, it will, come on, I might need your help. No point. As I backed away from Pierre's quivering body, Cullen looked on with concern. "What's happened?" I said. "I thought we were going to the aerodrome." "We are," I said. "Then why do you need a radio?" To let them know we're coming," I said, decking out of the tent. "You're lying," Colin cried as he chased after me. "Just like Father lies when he says I can join up when I'm older. We're stuck out here, aren't we?" "We're not stuck," I said. "Peld isn't well enough to travel. We'll head out once he's better." "But he said there's no point, that we're doomed." "Like I said, he's mad. Don't worry, I've got out of tougher scrapes. We'll be all right, truly." But Colin continued to glare at me. "Do you promise?" he said. "Promise?" I said. "You give your word?" I sighed, having grown tired of this game. "I give you my word," I said, and I shook his hand. Goodness knew how long the ruse would work. Hopefully we'd be rescued before I found out. As we neared the wreck, the stench of the pilot's corpse caused Colin to stagger back and retch. "I think we'd better cover him up, like Ivan," I said. "It's not dignified leaving him out like this." But as I clambered back into the cockpit, Colin remained rooted to the spot. "Well," I said, "get to it." Colin glanced warily at the corpse and wrinkled his nose. "Aren't you going to help? Can you fix a radio?" I said. Colin shook his head. "Then get to it," I said. "We can have our water ration early then. How's that?" Reluctantly, Colin began entombing the pilot stone by stone while I set about examining the radio. Removing the metal cover, I discovered to my relief that the delicate glass valves were all intact, as was the rest of the circuit. The only damage appeared to be a snapped battery cable, which was easily spliced back together. There remained only the problem of the battery and how much charge it still held. Returning to the cockpit, I found an ammeter mounted at the bottom of the instrument panel, which I removed and connected to the battery. The needle swung across the dial, stopping 3/4 of the way across the scale. Plenty of charge. Buoyed by this good fortune, I reached for the power switch, only to realize I was missing one key component: headphones. So I returned to the pilot's body and snatched the flying helmet from his head before Colin could cover it up. Back in the cockpit, I threw the power switch, and after a moment, that familiar hum and crackle came filtering through the headphones, the sweetest music I had ever heard. Once more, I had snatched hope from the jaws of despair. Through the long day, I crouched in the cockpit, slowly sweeping through the frequencies while I banged out the same endless distress call. SOS, SOS, aeroplane down, tail number PRI 1435. But though a constant chatter of signals reached my ears, no station answered my calls. Days passed, yet Pierre's fit did not subside. Every time I tried to coax a pipeful of keef or his water ration into his mouth, he fought me off, and steadily he grew weaker and weaker. So we remained camped by the wreckage, our water supply steadily dwindling. Many times I thought of abandoning Pierre and riding off with Colin, but Ivan's words kept thundering in my ear. Always stand by your comrades. So day after day I returned to the wreck and cast my desperate plea into the ether. For the first few days, Colin occupied himself by gathering stones into a large signal that could be seen from the air, but soon he too succumbed to the heat and retreated to the shade of the tent. Whether he still believed my ruse, I did not know. Perhaps it no longer mattered to him, for with our meager water supply we could never survive a crossing of the desert. We had no choice but to stay put and hope to be rescued. On the fourth night I gathered wood from the wreckage, and with the pilot's matches and letters from the mail compartment I managed to build a small fire. But the dry wood burned quickly and our fuel was soon exhausted, so I fashioned a torch from the last scraps of wood and canvas, and by its light returned to the wreck to retrieve the pan of oil and petrol I had collected. But just as I was lowering the torch into the pan, a hand shot out from the darkness and restrained me. "Don't do that," said Pierre, his voice barely a rasp. "You'll kill us all." You're back," I stammered. "How long have I been out?" said Pierre. 3 days. Pierre groaned and began groping about in the darkness. I handed him the water bag, and though he must have been ravenously thirsty, like a good soldier he drank only his 3 daily rations. No more and no less. "Right," he said, sighing in relief. "Mix the petrol with sand, that's how we did it on patrol." Dutifully I followed his instructions, producing a strong, even flame by which to warm ourselves. "What's happened?" said Pierre. "I got the radio working," I said, "but I haven't been able to raise anyone. Is there any more petrol left?" "I don't know," I said. "Why?" "We'll need a signal," said Pierre, "for when they come looking for us. If we burn one of the tires, it will give nice, thick black smoke." I gaped at Pierre, stunned by his sudden recovery. But in the glow of the fire, I soon saw the glint of the syringe and empty morphine vials at his feet. "We'll work in shifts," said Pierre. "You take the morning, I'll take the afternoon. But—" "It's all right," said Pierre. "I'll be all right." And with that, he lay back and fell swiftly to sleep. The following day, I signaled until midday, whereupon Pierre relieved me in the cockpit. Before returning to the tent, I drained the remaining petrol from the airplane's tank and mixed it with sand and strips of rubber cut from the airplane's tires, creating a beacon that could be lit at a moment's notice. Unable to sleep, I distracted myself by perusing the pilot's effects. In his wallet, I found an identity card identifying him as Robert Morin, age 30, from Marseille, as well as a stack of franc notes, a handful of receipts, and a pair of ticket stubs marked La Merveilleuse Madame Malala at the Theatre Chic in Rabat. The notebook proved more interesting, its pages filled with light-hearted caricatures. Among these was a man labeled simply Exo, easily recognized by his thinning hair, large drooping eyes, and comically large ears. Appearing alongside him in dozens of comic vignettes was another figure named Moreau, doubtless the alter ego of the late Monsieur Morin himself, always drawn in pilot's garb with an absurdly oversized nose. Rounding out this cast of characters was a slender, dark-haired woman, the woman from the photograph. Both her sketched likeness and her photograph bore the same name, as did the bag of stones, across which was scrawled, For Consuelo. These stones I found especially fascinating. Round and covered in hundreds of fine, blade-like crystals, they looked like nothing so much as petrified clover. They were a welcome glimpse of beauty in this drab wasteland. At last evening came, and I reached for the water bag, only to find it lighter than I remembered. "Colin?" I said. Colin groggily raised his head. "Did you drink from this?" Colin shook his head. "Then why is it nearly empty? There was a full day's ration in here last night." Colin shrugged, but then dropped his eyes to the ground, unable to hide his guilt. "Colin." "I'm sorry," Colin sobbed. "I couldn't help it. I couldn't stand it anymore." I wanted to scream at him. I wanted to throttle him, to beat him senseless. When you are dying of thirst, whoever stands in the way of your next drink becomes a mortal enemy. But I hadn't the strength, and soon I realized he was only a boy who didn't know any better. That night I went to bed thirsty. The next morning I set the camels free. There was no reason to keep them around, to let them slowly die of thirst. They were better off on their own, and as I watched them gallop away over the horizon, I wished them well. Days passed, and still no reply came. Reduced to half rations, Pierre and Colin grew ever weaker, rarely leaving the tent. Though cloying thirst racked my body, I forwent my own rations, stretching our supply just a little bit longer. For surely it was only a matter of time before we were found. Surely. When the long-awaited moment finally arrived, I very nearly missed it. Prostrate with exhaustion in the tent, I nearly slipped into unconsciousness when a strange sound suddenly roused me. A low hum, so faint I thought I'd imagined it. Steadily it grew louder and clearer, finally revealing itself as the unmistakable drone of an aero engine. "Pierre! Pierre, they're here!" I cried, scrambling out of the tent. Sweeping my gaze across the horizon, I quickly spotted it, a small black speck closing fast from the southwest. I ran to the beacon and tossed in a lit match, sending a tall column of thick oily smoke rising into the sky. Soon Pierre emerged from the tent, and together we frantically waved our burnouses over our head as the airplane closed in. Had I a voice left, I would have shouted for joy, for suddenly he dropped close to the ground, lining up for a landing. The buzz of the propeller grew deafening as the aircraft bore down upon us, rising to a throaty roar as it soared over our heads. But he did not set down, or circle around, but climbed and carried on his course, leaving us behind. I gaped at the sky, crestfallen as the airplane vanished over the horizon, the buzz of its engines fading into the wind. Beside me, Pierre slumped down against the wreck, calmly packed a pipeful of keef, and sat puffing away through dry, cracked lips, his sunken eyes staring off into oblivion. I don't understand," I said numbly. "He must have seen it. He must have." "Oh, they saw us all right," said Pierre, "no doubt about that." "But then why didn't he stop? Why didn't they rescue us?" "Because," said Pierre, "they thought we were ruffians. They thought it was a trap." At my bewildered expression, Pierre softly chuckled. He seemed oddly detached, untroubled. The fear, the badness, the fire in his eyes had all gone out. It was then that I realized. He had finally given up. "But," I said, "I signaled them in French. I told them everything, gave them the airplane's number, everything." "Any ruffian could do that," said Pierre. "No, they won't take any chances. Look what happened to this poor fellow." Feeling my last shred of hope evaporate, I sank to my knees and slumped against the wreck beside Pierre. Idly, I pulled the strange stones from my pocket and held them up to the sky, marveling as they sparkled in the sunlight. "Those are nice ones," said Pierre. "What are they?" I said. "Desert roses. We used to collect them to give out to our sweethearts." We sat in silence, staring off into the vast emptiness stretching out before us. "You know," said Pierre, "I don't think I ever thanked you." "Thank me for what?" "For letting me out," he said. "God, I thought I'd never see the outside of that cell. Ivan and Thierry and Stéphane and the rest, God bless them, they were good comrades, but even they would never go against the captain. But you did. You heard me, and you set me free, and I thank you for that." I felt my chest tighten. Dare I tell him I'd only let him out to save my own skin, to use him as a mad dog, a living weapon? Dare I tell him of all the times I'd planned to abandon him, to murder him in cold blood? I'd heard confession was good for the soul, especially when meeting one's maker, but despite the great weight of guilt pressing on my heart, I could not let those words pass my lips. Instead, I turned to Pierre and asked the question that had dogged me since first I'd boarded the Richelieu. "What happened?" I said. "To make you this way, I mean. What happened during the war?" Immediately a look of horror came over Pierre's face. I'm sorry," I said hastily. I didn't... No, said Pierre, taking a deep breath. "I'm all right, yes. I suppose you ought to know." Pierre sat silently for a long moment, sucking nervously on his pipe as he built up his nerve. Then, at last, he began his tale. "It was the last day of the war," he said. "The 11th, yes, the 11th of November. We'd just arrived in... What was it? Allemand. Yes, that was it, Allemand. We got the night before and dug in around the town when we got the message from headquarters that the armistice would take effect the next morning at 11. You can imagine how relieved we were. We'd broken through the German lines 3 months before and had been marching and fighting ever since, pushing the Boche all the way back into Germany. We'd lost half our men, and our commanding officer, Captain Nadurien. We were exhausted, all of us, and all we had to do now was wait one day, and it would all be over." Pierre took another long drag on his pipe before carrying on. The Germans were of the same mind. A few hours after we arrived, they put up signs around the town saying that they were also waiting out the war and wouldn't shoot at us. So that night we relaxed. There was an abandoned barn outside of the town, so we all gathered in there to drink, gamble, sing, let off steam. Remember how I said Jacques and I would cheat at cards like you did? Well, that night I hid up in the hayloft, looking down onto the table, and tapped out everyone's cards through a pillar. We were doing well. Nobody suspected a thing. That or they were all too drunk or too relieved the war was over to care. Then, around midnight, I heard the sound of a motor car approaching outside. In marches an officer, Captain Bazin. He was hot-headed, furious, chased everyone out, ordered all the men back to their posts. Now I was still up in the hayloft, and the only way down was a ladder in the middle of the room. In the Legion, gambling is tolerated, but cheating is a different matter, so I stayed where I was, waiting for him to leave. I remember he called for Jacques. He'd just made lieutenant and was the senior officer, and asked him what our plan was for taking the town. Naturally, he told him there is no plan. What would be the point? Just wait 11 hours and we can walk right in, he said. Well, the captain was having none of it, lost his temper and dismissed him, and his aide-de-camp too. Suddenly Pierre fell silent. He gritted his teeth and began to shake, as if holding back some great agony. It was many minutes and desperate drags on the pipe before he continued. That's when I saw it, he said. From his map case he took out the standard form and envelope the generals used to issue orders. I watched him fill it out, sign it, even fold and crease the envelope to look like it had been in a dispatch rider's bag. Then he sat down, poured himself a glass of wine, and waited. A whole hour before calling Jacques back. Then he held out the envelope and says... Pierre closed his eyes and took a long deep breath. He says, he's received orders from headquarters to take the town at 9 o'clock. But why, I blurted. Why would he attack if the war was about to end? Pierre sighed and shook his head. He wanted to prove himself, I suppose, cover himself in glory. Fresh out of Saint-Cyr, and they gave him his first command on the last day of the war. Of course Jacques protested, insisted there was no point, that they would be wasting soldiers' lives for nothing. But orders are orders, and the captain told him to get the men ready for the attack. Then finally he left the barn, and I climbed down. He left the order sheet on the table, so I took it along with some other papers to show that the handwriting was the same, and ran to Jacques. Another long pause. Pierre was on the verge of tears, though his eyes were too dry to cry them. I should have known, he croaked. I should have seen it, that face he always made, that grin when he was plotting something. He told me he would take care of it, that he would stall the attack until the last minute, until the stroke of 11. But until then, we had to prepare, as if we were actually going to attack. So he told me to go up and set up a forward observation post. There was a ruined church on a hill near the town, and I had to run a telephone line there and hide in the cellar, to watch the town, report on what I saw. The Germans said they wouldn't shoot us, so I just walked out in the open. Then I waited. 6 hours, 7, 8. It was cold, I remember, very still. The sun was starting to rise, the birds were singing. I thought it was thunder, a storm in the distance. Then I could barely make out his words over the tortured sobs. Then the first shell fell, then I can't... He called it on me, called it on top of me, buried me under. 2 days down, dark. It was so dark, 2 days before they... As Pierre trailed off, whatever glimmers of lingering admiration, whatever scraps of grudging respect I still harbored for Jacques and the captain evaporated. May they burn in hell. How about you, said Pierre after a moment. What were you doing aboard the Richelieu? Having recounted my journey many times, and with my strength quickly fading, I was reluctant to launch into it again. After all, soon none of it would matter. But what had Pierre's story mattered, or any stories for that matter? It is said one's life flashes before one's eyes before they die, and I suppose there is no harm in getting ahead of oneself. So I told Pierre everything, from my earliest memories in London to that very moment. But I had just reached Prince Pablo's betrayal when Pierre gave a grim, raspy chuckle. What a world we've made, Edward, he croaked, slowly shaking his head. Hard enough to know the man standing right in front of you. You can know him your whole life and have no idea. But over the ether or across continents? How can you ever know? In another time or place I would have made little of these words, thinking them merely the idle musings of a man awaiting death. But no sooner did they leave his lips, something stirred deep within my mind, and like a small breaker far at sea growing into a massive swell, I was suddenly struck with an idea so profound and obvious it was a wonder I hadn't thought of it before. Propelled by this fresh swell of inspiration, I staggered back to the tent and gathered up all the pilot's effects. What are you doing?" said Pierre as I returned to the wreck, but I stumbled straight past him and into the cockpit, laying Morin's effect across the floor before switching on the wireless. Cap Juby, SOS, SOS I signal. Ceci Moreau. This is Moreau. Only static answered me. I twisted the dial until the familiar patter of distant voices trickled into my ears before reaching again for the key. Hours passed. Perhaps it was days. As my strength slowly boiled away, I slipped once more into that feverish delirium where time had no meaning, my hand carrying on of its own accord on the signal key. I was only roused from my stupor by a sudden burst of Morse blaring in my ear. "Moreau, c'est vraiment toi?" it said. "Moreau, is that really you?" "Yes," I replied. "Tail number PRI 1435. What is your position?" I paused and glanced at the chart. I had a vague idea of our location, but nowhere near accurate enough to effect a rescue. Worse still, I could not decipher the name of the fortress, the nearest landmark. I could make out an E, an F, a D, possibly an O. "Approx 100 kilometers north of Efod," I replied. "Say again," the operator replied. I squinted again at the chart. Was that an L or an R? "Approximately 100 kilometers north of Erfod," I tried again. "Confirm with sextant reading." I froze. I had searched the wreck top to bottom and not come across the sextant, and even if I hadn't the strength nor the practice to take a proper reading. What to do? How could I? "Acknowledge. Confirm with sextant reading." "Sextant broken in crash," I hastily signaled. "Understood," came the reply. I breathed a sigh of relief. "What is your condition?" the operator asked. "Aeroplane destroyed," I replied. "Water almost out. Come quickly." After a moment I added, "Is Exo there?" Knowing nothing of Morin's fellow pilots, my ruse, I realized, would work best on the mysterious Monsieur Exo. "One moment," the operator replied. The minutes that followed passed like hours, but at last a new message trickled into my ears. "Exo here," it said. "Thought you were dead." I glanced down to the paper strewn across the floor. How would Monsieur Morin respond, I wondered. It was clear he was a jovial fellow, always ready with a jape, but in my half-delirious state I could hardly think. My eyes must have swept over those papers 1,000 times, searching in vain for something, anything to say. But my head was barren, filled with sand and dust. "Moreau?" said Exo. Then my eyes fell upon the ticket stubs for the magnificent Madame Malala. My thoughts turned to Madame Fatima and her pretty girls and the men who came to see them. "I thought I had after seeing Madame Malala," I signaled. After a moment, Exo replied, "I know what you mean." Though every inch of me ached from the sun and the sand, I managed a weak smile. It was working. "Come quickly," I implored him. "No water left." And after glancing down at the little paper bag of rocks, I added, "I have a gift for Consuelo." Suddenly, the signal seemed to go dead. Though the battery was nearly discharged, I could still hear the faint hum and crackle of the carrier wave through the headphones. 1 minute passed, then 2, then 3, and no further signals came. Fearing the worst, I reached again for the key. "Exo, are you there?" I felt my heart leap to my throat as the reply came through. "Who is this?" "Moreau," I quickly signaled back. "Prove it," said Exo. "What do I call Consuelo? What do I call my wife?" What does he call his wife? My heart leapt to my throat. I had gone too far, blown the whole ruse. Frantically I shuffled through the papers, searching for some hastily scrawled note, some small clue I had overlooked. Time was of the essence. If the two men were friends, Morin would have answered in a heartbeat. As the seconds ticked past, I scrutinized every page, every scrap of paper, but I found nothing. "Well?" said Exo. "Say again," I replied. But this granted me no more than a few seconds' respite, for Exo immediately repeated his query. My heart was pounding in my ears. What would he call his wife? What would he call his wife? The name on the back of the photograph was Consuelo. All the caricatures in the sketchbook were labeled Consuelo. Even the packet of stones was labeled Consuelo. What else would he call her? Stones. What had Pierre called them? Desert flowers? No, desert roses. Could that be it? "Well?" said Exo. "Signal breaking up," I repeated. "What do I call my wife?" he immediately pounded back. Oh, it can't be that simple, I thought. But the time for thinking was over. It was now or never. Knowing I was doomed either way, I took a leap of faith. Desert Rose, I tapped. I counted the seconds as they slowly ticked by. 1, 2, 3, 4. There was a loud crackle, and the carrier signal suddenly disappeared. I leapt upon the key, frantically firing off a desperate SOS, but after a few minutes the ammeter needle fell against the starting peg, the valves went dark, and the signal over the headphones faded to silence. And with it went my last shred of hope. As I lay within the wreck, waiting for the end to come, I wondered how Prince Pablo had done it. He must have pursued dozens of marks at once, some wiser than others. Or perhaps he had simply found the perfect mark, a stupid, deluded little boy with vain dreams of adventure and glory. On the 6th day, the wind picked up, growing into a full-blown sandstorm. The azure sky turned to dark khaki, the canvas walls of the airplane flapping and billowing like sails, and a steady rain of sand filtered through the cockpit opening, slowly covering my body. I wondered how the end would come. Would I die of thirst, be buried alive, or would the foxes and vultures descend to finish me off? And how would it come to this? I had always expected to die at sea, dragged beneath the waves to a quick, peaceful end by drowning, not slowly buried beneath the hot, suffocating desert sands. Though stained khaki brown, the dark skies above me were very much like the iron-gray clouds which hung over Bell Rock. What would my life have been, I wondered, had I decided to stay? Though I might have endured several more years of grey exile, at the end of it all I would have gone to the academy, trained as an officer, and become a true sailor. If only I had trusted Father. If only I had been patient. If only I hadn't fallen for Prince Pablo's lies, or Jacques, or Sean's. If only I'd been able to save Pierre and Colin. If only. No, I thought. The sky looked more like murky water, seen from the ocean floor. I could even see a shark circling above, its looming shape flitting in and out of view. Could even hear its low roar as it passed. Perhaps that was how it would end, I thought, eaten by a shark. A fitting end for a mariner. But suddenly I remembered. Sharks didn't roar, and the fins of this creature were far too large. Addled with thirst, it took me a long moment to realize that it wasn't a shark. It was an aeroplane. With Herculean effort, I hauled myself out of the cockpit and into the howling wind. Once more the airplane roared low overhead before climbing and disappearing into the dust. He was so close I could nearly reach up and touch him, but in the brown haze, even the brightly painted wreck was all but invisible. I had to send some sort of signal before he gave up and flew off. But the radio battery was dead. He'd used up all the petrol. There was nothing left to burn. Helpless, I sank back into my wood and canvas coffin and watched my salvation skim past just out of reach. So near, yet so far. Wood. Canvas. Those words rattled around hollowly in my mind for an age, and it was not until the distant buzz of the circling airplane faded into the wind that I made the crucial connection. With my last remaining strength, I reached for the matchbox, struck a match, and held it to the wall. It caught instantly, a black circle spreading across the brick-red canvas. But the moment the canvas burned through, the wind blew in and snuffed out the flame. I tried again and again, but each time the flame was snuffed out before it could catch. As the airplane made what I feared was its final pass, I struck another match and tossed it into the footwell. The wood and canvas, saturated with oil and petrol dripping from the engine, immediately burst into flame. As I started to crawl free of the wreckage, the wind blew through the cockpit and once more extinguished the flames. In desperation, I returned to the footwell and rekindled the flames, shielding them with my body as they licked and rose and the wood timbers charred and glowed. I gritted my teeth and braved the searing heat, waiting until the last possible moment before scrambling from the wreck. The moment I was free, the airplane burst into a pillar of flame, the wing's canvas covering burning away to reveal the wooden skeleton beneath. As the flames leapt high into the swirling brown skies and the roar of the aero engines filled the air, I cracked a weak smile and collapsed to the ground. After that, I remember little. A dark figure approaching through the swirling dust, floating above the ground. A mighty roar, a blast of wind, and climbing higher and higher, up above the choking dust and into a bright azure sky, leaving the barren bled far below. And then, darkness.